Hello and welcome back to my third and final video in my series on teaching Black history. In the first two videos in the series, I unpacked two common critiques of how social studies and history are taught in K-12 schools. Everything I said in those videos is historically and pedagogically true, but I would be lying by omission if I didn't mention that sometimes teachers, especially white teachers, do a bad job of teaching racial history. And the mistakes that some of these teachers made haunt my nightmares. There are several things that can go wrong when you start talking about race, even when you talk about it from a historical academic perspective. There's a column from Perspectives on History, which is published by the American Historical Association, which I read to help work through some of my thoughts on this topic. To summarize, at the time of writing this column, he had been a college professor for about 10 years. His work included research on the civil rights movement, and so he began to teach a Black history class. Although the classes were a hit amongst the students who took them, interest in them waned over the years until there was a spike in enrollment of Black students and demand for these classes rose again, only for these students to balk at having a white teacher teach Black history. Students argued with his choice in textbooks on the basis that they were written by white historians or by Black historians who weren't Black enough. Oreos. This not Black enough sentiment is echoed by Brenda Stevenson in her response to the initial column. She argues that any professor, by virtue of being a professor, are symbols of an academic tradition which historically has denied the intellectual capability, cultural contributions, and general humanity of African Americans. And it wasn't just interpretive scholarship either. One of Noble's students left class because of a primary document he found offensive, in which a slave mentioned that she had affection for her master, and he never came back to class after that. Additionally, students didn't want to learn about hardships. They wanted to learn about Afrocentrism, the idea that Africa is the center of the world and that everything and everyone worth knowing came from Africa. Now, this isn't true, of course, but it's not actually any more false than what white people claim about Europe. But these students didn't want to hear that. They didn't want academic rigor in their Black history. They wanted a safe space. So a white professor asking them to think critically about tough subjects that made them feel sad wasn't exactly what most of them had in mind. Ultimately, Noble felt that he couldn't establish the level of trust that he needed to have good communication with his students, and he made the decision to stop teaching Black history. His decision was informed by a few different factors, including his race, but also the fact that neither he nor his students were supported by the administration and the administration's large-scale neglect of the Black student body. Now, a couple of things here stand out to me. I, like Noble, am very impressed by these students' ability to read, critically analyze, and argue their assessment of the textbooks with their professor. I did that a couple of times too in school, and it's an important step in really getting your legs under you as a historian, so good for them. Second, I was surprised at Noble's decision to stop teaching Black history, which is a shame because he sounds like he's a decent teacher. I didn't get the impression that he didn't care or wasn't responsive to student feedback. But I guess when you have the luxury to pick and choose which classes you're going to teach, you're going to stick to the ones that you feel are best received. The thing about K-12 is that you can't rethink your decision to teach Black history like Vince Noble did. Whatever's on the curriculum, they're going to teach it. From that point of view, I actually related most strongly to Leon F. Litwick, who states, "Faculty members at community college not only teach more courses, but are expected to offer a diversity of subjects, many of them outside of their research focus and not necessarily reflective of their graduate training and scholarship." His suggestion is to afford Black Americans as much agency as possible, because while Black history is full of cruelty and pain, it's also full of resourcefulness and survival. Or as Brenda Stevenson says, you have to be able to get into a headspace where you can teach Black history from a Black perspective, while at the same time not letting the discussion go completely off the rails into pseudo-academic radical Afrocentrism. So the solution to the problems that seem to come up when teaching race history is to really lean into the history element of things and to treat the historical subjects as agents in their own lives and stories. Well, I can certainly do that, but what if I mess up? In this next section, I'm going to share some stories from real classrooms, real teachers, who really thought these were good ideas. We've got the classic slave auction, and I'm going to be a little bit vague on the details because this just keeps happening. For example, in 2011, a teacher in Norfolk, Virginia decided to bring her Civil War history to life by racially segregating her students and having them auction each other off. She lost her job for this, but it's not just a Southern issue. Something very similar happened in 2018 in Maplewood, New Jersey under the supervision of a substitute teacher. And in 2019, a teacher at a private school in Westchester put together a similar lesson plan, and they also lost their job. I'd like to say that the lesson here is don't hold a mock slave auction and you'll be fine, but I don't think it's that simple. The thing is, there are reasons that these teachers thought that they were doing a good thing. They thought the activity would bring more life to what they were teaching and would show the students how bad the practice was. For a lot of historical topics, activities, even activities similar to this one, can be instructive. For example, one activity on the Salem witch trials goes like this. Everybody gets an identity. Either they're a citizen, a witch hunter, or a witch. Then the class has a certain amount of time to figure out who the witch is. But the catch is, there is no witch. And what this shows is that there are no witches in the classroom, just like there were no witches in Salem, but people can still be stirred up into a finger-pointing frenzy, and people, often women, can be punished over nothing. Now, while there are some similarities between these two activities, there are some pretty big differences. She heard me talking about the witches. For one, in the witch trial activity, students aren't being segregated by any innate characteristic. Boys can be witches, theoretically. Girls can be witch hunters. The slave auction example, on the other hand, does divide students based on innate characteristics and continues to reinforce existing racial tensions that I've already explored in this series. Second, there are a lot fewer feelings and a lot less trauma associated with 19 people in Massachusetts dying 330 years ago as compared with all of slavery. Slavery lasted for hundreds of years, and the impact of it still exists today. And while sexism is the most universal prejudice, we don't get accused of being witches anymore. A lot of women actually find strength from that witchy archetype. You know, there's a sense in which they only killed us because they couldn't handle our power. That's their problem. There's one other reason why I think these teachers thought that doing a mock slave trial was a good idea, and I haven't seen their lesson plans, so this is just an educated guess, but there have been a couple of mock slave trials done at historic sites. I'm guessing that this reenactment resonated with the teachers, and they wanted to bring a little of that into their classroom. The irony is that these events, hosted by Colonial Williamsburg and the National Park Service, were also controversial and for a lot of the same reasons. Colonial Williamsburg's slave auction was heavily protested, and not just by white people who didn't take Black history seriously. The NAACP, for example, did not want to see Black characters put in a position of weakness and didn't think that a live performance where audience members might get the wrong idea and try to bid on an actor would facilitate learning. And part of the reason the program worked is that the program director had contingency plans in place for everything that could go wrong. She was incredibly thorough in her preparations, and if you're curious to see what the program looked like, I'll link below. Now fast forward 17 years and the National Park Service slave auction was much better received all around. It attracted a lot of support from the Black historical community and actually attracted more applications to be a part of the reenacting than they could accept. And there were still some people who wondered, why would you want to engage with such a sad history? But by 2011 the answer was, it's history. We have to make this feel real. And it's not lost on me that one of the mock slave auctions in the classroom also took place in 2011. Again, there are some big differences between museum reenactments and classroom reenactments. All of the actors, both in 1994 and in 2011, knew exactly what they were getting into. They chose to be there, they knew the history ahead of time, and the program directors took pains to take care of their actors and to make sure that the audience took away the right messages from the program. Also, the museum events were specifically spectator only. There was actually a contingency plan at Colonial Williamsburg where if an audience member tried to place a bid on one of the actors, they'd be told by the auctioneer that only registered bidders were allowed to bid today. This kind of planning keeps people, especially white people, from role-playing as a slave master. This protects the dignity of the actors more so than the teachers who place their black students, not by their choice or consent, in a position to be seen by their white classmates, even briefly, as a commodity. In order for students to learn, they have to feel safe. Physically safe, psychologically safe. If students feel like they're under attack and feel like their teacher isn't going to step in to help them, or if the teacher is the origin of that harm, they can't learn. As we've seen in these examples, this can span anywhere from not being able to build trust and rapport with your students, all the way to treating your students like objects in a lesson on slavery. But no matter where you fall, learning is going to slow or stop completely. It's a reminder to teachers to use lesson plans to further educational goals, and to have your peers and the administration look over lesson plans on sensitive topics. And here I conclude my 3-part video series on teaching Black history and concerns in the social studies classroom. And what about you? Everyone has a social studies horror story. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, and as always, my link to my Ko-fi is in the description below.